And
Of course, sir.
thanks everybody for being here as well. We're going to kick this thing off here. I know we got a few other folks that are still joining. If you haven't been on this thing before, so I'm going to lead this session. I'm Leif Babin, president of Echelon Front, co-author of Extreme Ownership, Economic Leadership. Spent 9 years in the SEAL teams, learned some very humbling lessons on the battlefield, and had to pass those lessons on to the next generation of SEALs through a leadership training program. And that's what we do now at Echelon Front. And we get a chance to work with awesome first responders across the country, and even some organizations internationally as well. So appreciate all you guys being on here with us today. I got lead on the session. Also have Chief Roger Shy from Pocatello Police Department, who's going to share some thoughts from the law enforcement side. We also have Chief PJ Langmaid from Black Forest Fire Department that's going to be sharing some thoughts from the fire side as well on this. And then we're going to open it up for questions. So if you got questions, put those in the chat. If you don't know how to use Zoom, there's a chat box. Just hit your chat box. If you could just list question out in all caps before you type that question, that enable us to get to that, so that we don't have a whole lot of time here, but we'll try to get to every question that we can to answer your questions. We always say at Echelon Front that we make our money through Q&A, and that's because this is where we can talk about leadership concepts, but it's really not until you think about, okay, how does that apply to me directly in this situation? And that's what we want to help you. We want to help you do that. So with that, we're going to kick things off. And really the theme for today is, when should you be thinking strategically? And the answer is, you should be thinking strategically all the time.
Always.
This is a question, exactly. And this is a question that Jocko got that asked at a muster last year or year before. You know, when should I be thinking strategic? Like, there's a time when you should be thinking, hey, tactically, let me not worry about the strategic. You should be thinking strategically all the time. And no matter what level of leadership that you are, whether you're a frontline trooper, not in charge of anybody else, but yourself and your piece of the mission, or whether you're in a leadership position in charge of a team, whether it's a big team or a small team, it doesn't matter. You should be detached and thinking strategically all the time. And so that's really what we want to talk about today. And so I asked Chief Shy and Chief Langmaid to share some examples with us, because I think they've done an excellent job of building relationships with their community, of using media to capture what they do, and in order to educate the community about what first responders are doing, how you support the community, and basically what's at stake if you're underfunded, right? If you're undermanned and understrength and not able to go out and do your jobs. And then also, obviously, that ties into recruiting efforts as well. So this is something that was a difficult concept for me as a SEAL on the battlefield, is thinking strategically. And even though I was an officer, I was in a leadership position on my first platoon. I was a squad leader in charge of 8 SEALs. So I was, the second officer so an assistant platoon commander in charge, of a 16-man SEAL platoon. But it was very hard for me to think strategically about things. We were very tactically focused. When we were thinking about hitting targets, we wanted to blast the door in, and we wanted to keep our guys as safe as possible. And obviously, that's your job as a leader, is to protect your team and keep your guys as safe as possible. The scrutiny about taking photographs on the battlefield, things like that. The Abu Ghraib story had broke. And if you remember the Abu Ghraib story, that was a major issue in my mind. When we saw these pictures of, from coming out of Abu Ghraib prison, we had prisoners that were put in compromising situations, and some soldiers that were taking pictures with them and giving the thumbs up, and kind of, they were degrading pictures. They were degrading pictures. But in our mind, I was like, look, these are terrorists that were captured. They deserve a lot worse than that. I didn't think that was that big of a deal. I think in the SEAL teams, we kind of largely dismissed that. And yet the reality was, this was a major deal. It was a major recruiting effort for the enemy. For Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is what the terrorists called themselves at the time. They were saying, look what U.S. forces are doing. Look, they're the bad guys. They were able to drive recruiting efforts based on these photographs and video that had come out of Abu Ghraib. It was a giant deal. And so it was one of those things where tactically, I didn't think it was a big deal. Like, okay, some photos were taken, no one was harmed. What's the big deal, about these photos? And yet, strategically, it was a massive, massive loss, because people weren't thinking about it in that way. And so, in the SEAL teams, we had some photos that came out that were, there was a shutter. If you remember the old Shutterfly accounts, there was a SEAL that I was serving with on my first deployment, who had been on the previous deployment, and he had his Shutterfly account, which was basically like an online service, basically a cloud-based a photo service. And that account was hacked by a news organization that got a hold of his photos. And these were a bunch of photos that he didn't even know. I think his wife had uploaded them. He didn't even know that they were uploaded, at least according to him. But he got a call. He made a call back home on his Iridium phone to his wife, and he came in just kind of stone faced and said, "Hey, I got some bad news. The press is all over, threatening my wife that they're going to run these photos, and they have these photos." And so the photos were a bunch of had been taken and on the battlefield, and they showed SEALs with prisoners. The photos weren't even, they had bags over their heads. At the time, that was totally legal. It was in accordance with rules of engagement. But after Abu Ghraib, that stuff had been suppressed. And even though the photos had been taken a year prior to this, it didn't matter. They were able to run these photos, and they were basically accusing his SEAL platoon of having, of doing prisoner abuse. And the photos, it was ridiculous. It went to a level where his assistant platoon commander, which was the job that I was currently in my current platoon. So his previous platoon, his assistant platoon commander, is what we call the MACO officer. So this is the marshaling control officer. You may have a similar term, who is actually, he's directing where to go. So there's a picture of a SEAL with directing a prisoner, and he's standing in front of the prisoner going like this. And you could tell as the MACO officer, the marshal control officer, he said, "Hey, take this guy down to room, to this room." Well, the press was running this with the caption that SEAL about to punch this guy in the face, like he's threatening violence to this guy because his fist is in the face, even though his thumb was pointed in the direction he wanted them to go. And that actually became a billboard that got run. The billboard was put up, I think it was in Cuba. There was one in Cuba. There was one in Syria where pictures were taken of billboards that were put up. Look at what the evil United States is doing and how they're abusing prisoners and the terrible things they're doing. And it wasn't even true in this case, but that's what the press had made it look like. And so, the word came down, like, no more photos. No, you can't take photos with personal cameras on any of your operations. This is a major problem. And it was a hard adjustment for me to think about, hey, listen, what I'm doing right now, even if it's not bad, can be construed as bad and actually taken and used by our enemies and generate support against us and recruiting efforts, and it can cause all kinds of problems. And I think that the biggest thing that we had to do was show the world, like, listen, we're the good guys. We're fighting the bad guys. These people do evil, horrible things to innocent Iraqi people. This was in the conflict of Iraq. They're the bad guys. We're the good guys, and we can't have them, depicting otherwise. And this is really the fight that you're in all the time, right? As first responders, to be thinking strategically about how what you're doing is actually helping, and how you're doing is actually protecting the people that can't protect themselves, building those relationships with the communities, talking about the good things that you're doing against otherwise evil and bad people that want to do terrible things to folks and can actually put them in harm's way. So, and whether that's on the fire side, whether it's on the EMT side, whether it's on the law enforcement side, it's something that you have to be thinking about. And one more thing I just wanted to say about this is, I think a lot of us in the SEAL teams at the time, we just kind of took for granted, like, of course we're the good guys. Of course they're the bad guys. We see what kind of horrible things they actually do to innocent Iraqi people. We see what kind of horrible things that they're willing to do, to talk people into being suicide bombers and to prey on folks that maybe even have special needs. And that's somebody that they're going to, like, prey on to utilize to drive a VBID, into an enemy position. And so we kind of took that for granted. And a case in the civilian world that I saw this happening was in the NFL a couple years ago, where we've done some work with NFL teams, and I had some relationships with some general managers, and one in particular that I had a long-standing relationship with, who'd been around for a long time. And I think when all of the Colin Kaepernick kind of anthem protests started to come out, I was in communication with these guys, and they're very patriotic Americans. They support law enforcement. They support military, and most of the guys I knew that were involved with the NFL actually do that. And so I think they thought that their goodwill and the good things that they did for the military and for veterans would overcome this kind of visible kind of anthem protester led issues, wokeness, for whatever in that term, if you want to use that term. And it's something that caused, in their minds, they were really caught off guard. I think that a lot of longtime NFL fans stopped watching the NFL, stopped supporting the NFL based on what they saw as like, listen, this is anti-American, and I'm not gonna support that. So even if that's what the corporate social media for the NFL was putting out, even if that's it was only a fairly small group of players that were highly vocal and highly publicized that were leading that charge. And most of the people in the NFL are actually pretty dang patriotic, pro-American, pro support to first responders and veterans, and yet it didn't come off that way, and it cost them very dearly. And I think they had to come back and actually put some rules in place to prevent that kind of stuff from happening. And it took a good couple of years, but a lot of damage was already done. So we talk about this idea of being default aggressive, and default aggressive is, we don't mean aggressive toward people, right? It's aggressive toward accomplishing the goal, accomplishing the mission. And it's the Marine Corps calls it a bias for action. It's being proactive rather than being reactive. And I think that's what you have to do when you're talking about building relationships. This is what in the military we call the information operation campaign. We're trying to actually put out information and put the truth out there ahead of what other organizations that may try to spin that to make us look bad. We need to build relationships with our communities, to build relationships with our leadership, build relationships with the city councils that control our budgets, all those things. And you got to be super proactive to do that stuff all the time. And the moment that you slack, the moment that you're not thinking about this stuff, is the moment that you're basically giving your adversary, your competition, the bad guys, the people that are trying to undercut you, the upper hand. So you've got to be default aggressive to build those relationships, and you got to be thinking strategically all the time. And with that, Chief Shai, I'll turn it over to you if you want to talk about some of the efforts that you're doing, and then we'll turn it over to Chief Langmaid.
Sure. Yeah. And, what Leif's talking about here is building that leadership capital with your communities. And, you build it within your department with your people, let them know the why and why you're going out and doing those things, and getting that strategic mindset. And when he said, when should you be thinking strategically? Always. And, and not necessarily something bad has to happen in your community. So we saw that with George Floyd, where something happened in Minnesota, and that one event lit the entire country on fire. And that affected all first responders, because people didn't care to see what your badge said or what your patch on your arm said. All they saw was a blue uniform or a uniform. It didn't matter if you were police, fire, or EMS. We were having, fire personnel getting attacked across the country, EMS folks getting shot at. So it didn't matter. So, what we did here is we front loaded a lot of things with our community. We do a lot of work with Idaho State University and their athletic program. And when that happened, we had the student athletes reach out to myself and one of the local sheriff here, Sheriff Manu. And they asked if they could come meet with us. And we talked about it. And they said, we don't want to do a protest. We don't want to burn anything. We don't want to trash anything. We love our community. We love the relationship we have with you guys. So we brainstormed with them and came up with a unity walk, where we did a unity walk with them. And we ended up doing some leadership presentations at a community park. And we thought there was going to be like a couple hundred people that showed up. About 3,000 ended up showing up, and it was a pretty big event. It got some hits on Fox News, and it was a good thing for our community. So when you have those opportunities, don't look past those opportunities to volunteer or do something for your community to collect that leadership capital. One of the things I tell the officers here, I said, when you see a member of the police department here, I don't want the community to go, hey, there's a member of our department. I want them to say, that's my member of my department. That's my, and they take some ownership with us and we take ownership with them. And I think that that's very critical when you're talking about, the people that you serve. You got to get to know your community. What are the expectations within, the police department, the fire department, the EMS, and then that way you know how to respond to them and give them that good quality service that they're looking for, because the expectations might be a little bit different in Idaho than they are in Florida or New York. Some of the social norms might be a little bit different. So you get to know those people, get to know what their expectations are of you, and then you just make those small adjustments within that, and they build that capital every chance you get. And some of the things that I've seen have been real successful are you getting involved with your local school district, getting involved with your volunteer organizations like your Rotary, your Lions Club, your Kiwanis clubs, your homeless shelters. Every area on this call has a CASA or a court-appointed special advocates group. Get involved with that. Those are kids that have been taken into protective custody, and then you can get involved somehow helping that group out. Food drives for your food bank. All those things are all very good things to build that leadership capital, so that when something bad happens in the community, you can cash that in. Well, we had to cash in leadership capital for George Floyd, and it was something that didn't even happen in our community, or never, it wasn't even in our side of the country. It was, up in Minnesota, but we had to cash in some leadership capital. And I think that, this has changed everything in our world, the cell phone, and internet. It just doesn't happen locally. I remember when Rodney King happened, and I started my career off of San Diego County, and I was working down there, and we only had a couple of incidents in San Diego County, but there was incidents across some major cities. But now when something like that happens, it's played over and over and over again on the media. So think strategically, build those programs out within your departments, and then put it out on social media, put it out in the media, build those relationships with your local media so that you could share those events when they do happen. I think that that's important too. People see that we're doing those positive things. So PJ.
Thanks, Roger. Roger hit on something there, social norms for your community. And that goes back to the tact, tone, and delivery. And when you think about that, so what we say is going to be different in the Northeast as it is going to be in the Southwest. And I think that's really an important thing to look at. But when you're thinking strategically all of the time, one of the things that you need to be thinking about is social media. Social media is driving everything. It is the way that information is being passed. And when you look at what happened with the Arab Spring, that started in a marketplace in Tunisia, and that actually is still having an impact today. And that was 15 years ago, I believe now, maybe at least over 10 years ago. So one of the things that you think about is there's 4 levels that I think about all the time: is task, tactical, strategic, and grand strategic. The task level is really that 1 to 15 minutes where something needs to immediately happen. That tactical level is kind of that first 24 hours where it's that short term. And then strategic is thinking 1 to 5 years out. Everybody on a fire truck or in a patrol car should be thinking strategically all the time, because what they're doing is going to impact the ability for the department to operate for the next 1 to 5 years. Now, if you're in command level, you should be thinking grand strategic. That means you're thinking 5, 10, 20, 40 years out. You're not even part of the department anymore. You're thinking generationally. So one of the things we did in Black Forest was seeing the power of social media and realizing that in 5 to 10 years, there's threats of annexation and losing revenue, or the economy starts to go down and development starts to slow down. We start to lose revenue. What's that do for the mission? Because if you really think about the mission and the members all of the time, you are thinking strategically. But how do I make sure that we're going to maintain that service delivery? So we actually started a social media campaign where we hired a film crew to come in and start creating weekly videos, and they push it out. It's part of an information operation where basically we're saying, yeah, there's a recruitment benefit to it, but it's also building relationships with the community with the way that they're actually interacting with us now, which is online, more than stopping by a firehouse like they used to 20 years ago. So part of that also strategically lets our neighbors, our partner agencies, know where we're operating at, which drives a little competition, which means they're going to want to get better, which now is going to force my guys to want to get better. So we're actually trying to raise the bar in an extremely indirect method across the whole region. So that's kind of what I'm talking about when I'm looking at grand strategic. Is that's big picture level thinking there. And it was driven by looking at some social media stuff. The other thing to think about, and this for me is an example of the task level for strategic thinking, and I'll tell you a story real quick so we can get to some questions, is we went to debriefing is a big part of the culture of the Black Forest Fire Department. We debrief everything. We went to a traffic accident with people trapped in a neighboring jurisdiction. And when we got there, I got there later because I wasn't planning on going, but I heard a few things on the radio that made me think something was amiss. And when I got there, what I saw totally frustrated me because I realized that I had failed as a chief officer in communicating strategic thinking to my folks. So I actually took the rest of the time off from the firehouse because I was so frustrated. And then the next day we debriefed this. And the way we debriefed it was I asked them questions, not on how we did with the tools, but how did we do with building the relationships with our neighboring agency? How did they perceive our actions? How did they perceive our tact, tone, and delivery? And by the time we were done with that debrief, everybody had realized that we had not built any relationship capital with that organization. In fact, it had cost us significantly. And had we used the proper tact, tone, and delivery, we would have been successful at the task level and the strategic level simultaneously. And that was a good example. And I'm glad it happened because I was able to use it as an example to show them how to think strategically. Plus, it showed me that I was falling short on communicating that. So think strategically all of the time. That's all I got.
Appreciate that, PJ and Roger. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. What I like about this is kind of like, a lot of us in the military, and I'm sure you guys have it as well, right? We talk about like, well, I have an open door policy. If you're in a leadership position, I have an open door policy. Come talk to me. Well, something my colleague Dave Burke says, good deal, Dave, if you listen to Jocko podcast. But something he says is, look, you can't have an open door policy. You need to have an empty chair policy. Because people aren't going to come to you necessarily. You got to go talk to them. Most people don't have the courage to do that. So what I like about what you're talking about with the information operations campaign is you're pushing to them, right? People are on social media and you're pushing information. You're going to where the people are and you're pushing that information to them rather than waiting for them to come to you, stop by the firehouse and visit you like they might have done in years past. So I think that's great perspective.